Whether you love it or hate it, dating reality shows are not products you can fully opt out of. What they normalize or challenge eventually finds its way into every dating pool. And Peacock's colossal hit, Love Island USA, has become a dominant media product, both reinforcing and challenging the social narratives we have to live with. A few weeks ago, I did something I haven't done in a while. I finished a novel in a single sitting. That novel happens to be one of the most referenced books in my comment section this summer. This novel was pitched and described as a cross between Lord of the Flies and Love Island. It's called The Compound. Aisling Rawle is a former Dublin-based educator and author of this reality TV thriller, which was published in the summer of 2025. As online discourse and viral moments around game shows like Love Island USA intensify, it was hard not to notice references to and recommendations for her impossible to put down debut novel. This year, shows like Love Island USA/UK and Summer House continued production as scheduled, amid a relentless backdrop of unpopular wars, increasing economic anxiety, and pointed hostility towards immigrants, women, and people of color. As our audiences reflect on how popular programming enforces and reflects the social anxieties and hierarchies we have come to normalize, Aisling Rawle joins us for a conversation about her novel and the ideas that shaped it. I was super grateful for her very generous time, and I'm so glad I got to welcome her to the renewal of this podcast, The Process with Alex Baytal. I hope you enjoy. Thank you for joining us, Aisling. I so appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me.
Now, getting into some general questions about you, and I guess I should let you know too what's been happening on my page because I'm not going to assume you've seen, but every time I make a video on Love Island, I always cover the either Love is Blind or Love Island the last 2-3 years. And this year in particular, every single video, someone is recommending The Compound, your debut novel, to somebody else or to me, or saying, hey, when are you going to make a video on that? Or have we discussed how this lines up perfectly with what she was saying in this book? And I'm like, yes, I have made a video on it. I did read it in one day. And you're not alone. There's like a million other people here in the comments who are recommending your book. Now, I do have a question. Does this surprise you a year out from publication or no?
Kind of. I think I kind of, because it's been 3 years since I wrote it, I do frequently kind of forget that it happened. And yeah, I just kind of, if anyone tells me they've read it, I'm completely gobsmacked. I'm like, well, how do you know about it? Like those characters, they were just in my head. Like, so it's crazy, but it does feel kind of nice in a way that when there are kind of difficult conversations happening, maybe around some of these shows, that we're kind of comparing it to a kind of imagined dystopia and maybe making some connections. But I'm going to be totally honest and say that I haven't really been watching them for the last couple of years, and I do have FOMO, so anything could be happening on these shows, and I don't know, so I do feel kind of ignorant. But I've heard, definitely last year there were so many conversations about how kind of crazy things had gotten, but it also had, I think, Love Island particularly had really like ratcheted up in popularity in the States. So, but sure, as you know, at your page and your followers, there's so much to dissect and to talk about. So I'm definitely interested to hear your perspective on all of it.
Yeah, I couldn't believe it was the most streamed original unscripted product last year. It was something like 18 billion minutes streamed. And I had never even heard of this show. But I understand when you're saying that right now, as of late, you've not been keeping up with it. That was my entire early childhood. And later we will get into our different relationships with television. But that feeling of like knowing, oh, people are talking about this is affecting how people are relating to each other, what they're thinking in their own dating lives. But it can be a show or a product that you're just not at all engaged with. I know we're going to get into more specific intro questions that we have planned that cover things that I know my audience has asked me to ask you, but I just have to now ask, is part of why you've stepped back because it was just so much during COVID and then writing the book and now you're just done with it? Or is there another reason?
I kind of it interested me for a while, and then it not that I'm no longer interested in reality television. I think that I felt it was really fun as a kind of communal viewing activity. And when I was watching reality television, I was living with housemates and I also had social media. And I now live on my own and don't have social media, and it doesn't feel as fun. But also, I think that yes, the kind of communal element makes it seem a little less exploitative somehow. I don't know why. The kind of jumping online and seeing people having the same thoughts or maybe making jokes or memes or whatever. But I think particularly after writing the book, it all does seem a little bit more exploitative, and it's kind of it feels. I did kind of think last year I was like, oh, maybe I'll watch a couple of episodes of Love Island that everyone's talking about. I thought no, actually it feels better to just kind of remove myself entirely. And yeah, but again, I'm always interested to hear what the conversation is about, and I know that there's been really interesting conversations around particularly Love Island in the last year or two.
Yes, I my sister would agree with you in that if you're not watching it with other people, you're not texting, like you said, the even your the season of life that you're in shapes your relationship to the experience because it is an experience. And I cannot imagine doing or watching 30 something episodes of this nightly alone and not talking about it with anybody. It just seems dismal. And I also have to add that midway through your book, I remember texting my siblings and going, I'm never going to be able to watch Love Island in the same way again. Like, I feel sick. And like, I'm part of this too, because I'm part of the ecosystem that feeds into, even though we're dissecting it, we're breaking it down, we're critiquing it. No one is ever going to necessarily ask me to do ads for Love Island because of how I speak about it. It does feel like it feeds into the whole, like you said, the exploitative nature of like we're looking at these people in this fishbowl, this form of a panopticon, and creating these moral judgments about who's worthy, who's not worthy, who we should boot off, America, or I don't know if the UK has the element of voting people off because I'm a little still too new to this to know how much the voting aspect is part of. Were you able to vote or no?
Um, I like in the Republic of Ireland for whatever reason you weren't allowed to vote, but in
Oh,
the UK, I think, yeah,
oh,
classic.
it's okay, okay.
Yeah, but I think in the UK you were allowed to vote. I actually haven't seen any of the US one, but I think the rules are similar.
Maybe, and I'm getting to the point where I don't even trust the voting system, which is another very, I guess, American experience right now, because people are saying that they're voting one way and they're not sure if production is just doing what they want anyway. So that's a whole other thing. But I do want to get into your background and how you even came into this at all. So most of our listeners, they know your name, they know the book, they are very aware of the shows that we're going to reference today. But how did you come to all of this, and what experience even outside of reality TV led you to English and then this field of education?
Yeah, I think books had always been such a huge part of my life, and I knew from a pretty early age that I wanted to study English, and I didn't really know what to do with that. And I do remember my final day of secondary school getting my exam results from the principal, and he said, "Oh, what do you want to do?" And I said, "English," and he went, "Oof." And he was like, "What might you do with it?" I said, "Maybe teach." And he went, "Oof."
Oh
He
no.
was like, "No." He was like, "Do anything else." He really was like, "There's no jobs. It's not a good idea." But nevertheless, I studied English at an absolute ball, and I had been teaching piano to kind of pay my way through college, and then it kind of came to me that teaching English would be really just everything that I wanted, and that it was kind of having the teaching element and also being able to talk about books all day, every day was the dream come true. And yeah, so I started teaching in 2020, which was definitely a fun time to, get thrown in there. But I loved it. I'm actually not teaching anymore. I'm kind of on the other side. I'm studying now. But I love my time in teaching. I learned so much, and I definitely am going to go back to it at some point. But yeah, I think whether it was, reading, writing, or teaching, it's all just kind of been revolved around books, and it was all kind of getting at it in some way or another.
Was there a, I guess not was there, what age group were you teaching before? And is that going to be the same age? Which also, congratulations on continuing your studies. Do you think you'd be going back to that same age group or will it be different?
I'm not sure. I mean, I was teaching in secondary school, which covers from ages 12 to 18, which is a big, you have a total, a different experience with each year group, which is really nice and refreshing. I don't know if I'd go back to secondary school. It definitely appeals to me. Yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna keep writing for now, and I'll definitely make my way back in some way, shape, or form.
That's wonderful to hear. Also, later, yeah, I want to ask you, and I don't know if you're allowed to tell us, but if you're working on anything else, writing wise. But speaking about English and the study of English, and I know that's not neutral. And Ireland's history with the language of English and colonization from the British Empire, that spans centuries. I was looking at it thinking I was going to see like one burst of activity, and it was just like this like 1300s and this and then that. So there were outright bans, there were very oppressive restrictions around the native languages and dialects. And I know my American listeners would be curious about your relationship to the language, not only as a citizen, but as someone who's been a teacher and someone who's now published what is considered a social political thriller.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really excellent question. And 100%, 800 years under colonial rule, that those kind of scars never really go away. And the kind of aspect of language in Ireland is still kind of, I don't want to say contentious, but it's always definitely charged. And I think that you see that a lot in Irish storytelling, whatever it may be. There's kind of generally an awareness of the kind of socio-political situation, and whether that's, Sally Rooney with kind of Marxist undertones, or Maggie O'Farrell with kind of colonialism and memory and that impact there, it's always there. And I think that was always kind of necessitated by the fact that our language was kind of forcibly stolen from us, and now is kind of returning, very slowly. But even without that aspect of kind of stolen language and culture, for a very long time and up until very recently, to speak in Ireland was to be political, and that every word was politicised, particularly in Northern Ireland up until recently. And Patrick Radden Keefe writes really brilliantly about it in Say Nothing, where it's either kind of speak and get in trouble, or say nothing and hope for peace. And again, that conflict ended in 1998 and still very much lingers. So I think in a lot of Irish storytelling there's a kind of resonant sense of the importance of acknowledging the social strata, I guess, that we're existing in. And as well as that, I mean, taking away all the history, we have interesting neighbours on either side. We've got the UK and the US, and there's always some drama going on. And I feel sometimes we're just kind of here going like this. Not to say that everything is all tranquil in Ireland, but yeah, so I think that, I feel very lucky to have a really rich kind of literary history behind the period that I'm writing in, but also in the period that I'm writing in, that there's so many fantastic Irish writers and Irish actors and Irish musicians, and it's all building this kind of community where storytelling is really, really valued. So it's nice that we've kind of gotten to here.
Yeah, that it's also so important to think about how just even the ability, which is I think something in the states that certain demographics they don't grasp the just how radical it is that somebody from another demographic or community is even able to teach and interpret the very language that colonized them and their people. So just even when I was looking into your background, I thought, oh, yes, people could look at it and say, maybe it's a loss that this book wasn't written in another language. And yeah, you can acknowledge that it would be wonderful if there was a widespread ability for everybody to read this in an ancestral language. But at the same time, you are still coming to this project in your own teaching or in your history of teaching with that understanding and that what I guess we would call wokeness about what is going into all of this. And you're not just presenting this narrative or this history of a language from just that particular perspective. It's also the history of a people. And like you said, this social political awareness that you bring to those discussions. So that was just important for me. And I'm very grateful that you were willing to go into that. But I will say, because some people will be listening to this and they have no idea what we're talking about, what is your book about, or what was the log line, I guess you could say, you pitched? Because later we'll go into spoilers, but what's like the non spoiler general overview of your book?
The pitch had always been Love Island meets Lord of the Flies, and this is what I had said to my agent to kind of hope that she would become my agent, and it kind of followed me through every step of the journey. Yes, so it's 19 contestants on a reality television show and kind of satirical of reality television, and also kind of looking at kind of themes of consumerism and greed. And yeah, that's the vibe.
Particularly appreciated how you folded in the understanding that there's always been an influencer culture, even prior to social media and even post social media. We're not necessarily given an exact date of where and when the compound takes place, but that idea of using people's bodies to sell products, they're a product themselves. The entire compound is a backdrop for other products to be sold. And the narrative is just used to get people's attention so they could look at the products. That was fantastic. And even though it's not Lord of the Flies time period, or which we'll get into that later, I do want to ask you, aside from viewing Love Island and The Lord of the Flies, which is a classic, what other books inspired you to go even into this field of study that you're in and then write this novel?
Books that inspired me in terms of field of study, I think James Joyce was always my kind of, and remains my favourite. And I think that you could spend every day of the rest of your life trying to get to the bottom of what Joyce was talking about, and you'll never get there. And that to me is why it's worth studying, and to, have aspects of it explained to me by people who know so much more is so appealing. And that's why I wanted to come back to study and studying modernist literature now. And it's such a pleasure to have that. I think in terms of this book, Animal Farm was definitely a big influence, and that's where the epigraph comes from, and ideas of labour and again greed and kind of collective good intentions giving way to kind of capitalist greed essentially. There was kind of a lot, to be honest. There was a couple of books that I had read just before I wrote it, and they very much informed the tone. And that was The Guest by Emma Cline, and Penance by Liza Clark, and Leave the World Behind by Ruin Alam. And then also for the very opening, and actually for a lot of it, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting the name of it. The French novel where there's women trapped in the basement. Oh my God, I Who Have Never Known Men. That was definitely really appealing in that there's this kind of catastrophic event that's happened just beyond their basement, and we don't know what it is. But something that I loved about that book is that it opens with these women trapped in a basement, and it doesn't explain why they're there or what's happened. You just kind of follow them throughout the day to day, and I definitely wanted to carry that into the opening of of the compound. So those were some of the influences, but it's also hard to know. It's hard to know what kind of hasn't influenced or what particularly you take with you. But those were at the forefront, definitely.
I can feel though, I mean, when I started reading the book, that sense of where are we, what's going on, everyone's drugged and they're waking up, that those influences that you just referenced, that so perfectly ties into what so much of our audience brings or what our audience feels when they're watching a new show or they're getting acquainted with something like The Villa, because in a way it does seem to exist out of context. We know it doesn't exist out of context, but when you start these shows, like even Love is Blind, where these pods, people, you're in a pod and you're talking to people and nobody really knows where are the pods located. Is it a soundstage, is it an actual place? But they are given these mythical and social meanings, and that the place itself is a character. And I really love how you made the compound and that closed space. I remember in Leave the World Behind too, even just looking at the film adaptation of that, how yes, you're in this expansive neighborhood, but you do feel pretty much trapped to the house. The house is where all this activity happens, all those negotiations, that sort of thing. So that was fascinating to read, even though, say, someone reading it might not immediately pick up on that. The influence was definitely felt. I do want to go ask one more question about reading comprehension and teaching English. And even though you're not doing that right now, but you're studying it, we are in what my audience continually comments is a drought of media literacy or reading comprehension. There's a lot of jokes about children being left behind based off of the George Bush meme. How did you see your role as an English teacher in this particular evolving landscape? And what would you hope your former students or even potential future students think of when they view programming like this?
Yeah, I think just that, critical thinking needs to be at the forefront and to kind of question inherent wants and desires. So even in this case, why do we want to watch reality television and why do we want to maybe feel, if not superior, why do we want to kind of see people be humiliated or that what is considered dramatic is what is painful, and particularly in, Love Island with Casa Amor, it's like the highlight of the season, and this is when the most people are really, really hurt and betrayed and humiliated, and what is that reason? But, aside from reality television, of which, as you know, there are so many different lenses to view it through, I think to kind of just question desires that are normalized, I think is really, really important in terms of interrogating society. Just because something seems familiar doesn't mean that it's right. And, I wrote this over the summer, but I, was back to school and editing it, and the kids definitely kind of informed some of the things that went into it, and that, I had an incredibly smart, engaged group, and I kind of was asking them, what they wanted their life to look like, and they were very insistent that a good life was an easy life, and that meant kind of with as little labor as possible and comfort. And the kind of question of how this easy life came about wasn't really important, but really it was that you worked briefly so that you wouldn't have to work at all. And, I found these ideas really compelling, and that they were kind of able to articulate these desires that, is really inherent in society. And it was nice kind of going back in and maybe feeding some of these desires in. But I also do think that maybe young people get a bad rap for not having these critical thinking skills. I think that exposure to mass media has enabled them to be critical thinkers, but not in a way that's super, super helpful, and that their brains are kind of overloaded with information. But I think that the capacity is there and the tools are also there. I would love to see more young people read a little bit more, because I think viewing a lot of content can be really exhausting, and it's kind of can be calming to just sit with one person's thoughts. And sometimes hearing one person's story is enough to sustain you rather than a lot of snippets of many, many hundreds or thousands. But I have hope for the kids of today.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Also, so illuminating to, and I guess what I'm hearing is that we need to also be a little cautious about the snap judgments we might make because they are also happening in context. As we talk more about the book, there you might want to judge the protagonist Lily, but the more you learn about the world she's coming from, the more you start to think like, well, she's working so hard. It doesn't seem to be much opportunity if you're not in a particular profession. The the reality that especially in the States, you can have a respectable or a decent working class job and you still don't have enough money or space to go on holiday or rest or go to the doctor, that sort of thing. And I guess when you're a young person and you see that the most beautiful or safe lives seem to be those of social influencers who are simply videotaping their really lovely looking lives or their glamorous lives, and that just existing in that way is paying them, even though we know there's editing and it's part of a $1 trillion marketing campaign. I'm starting to have a little bit more of sympathy and just holding some of my judgment back before I even judge people who might go on a show like Love Island, because when you look at some of these contestants where they're working in a hardware store and they really don't see any other job for them aside becoming an influencer, when I put myself in their shoes, I can understand why, for your family, for your ability to maybe pay for your siblings' tuition, you might take the risk of humiliation and trade that privacy for that publicity. You might trade that so called respectable job for the shame and humiliation of, sitting on cakes on Love Island USA, which happened this season. But I do want to ask about your relationship to television, especially because I came into all of this. It's somewhat ironic for some of my mom's friends because my father and mother made it very clear that we were not going to have TV in the house. We were allowed like one VHS tape a week. It's typically Barney or something like that. And they really shielded us from seeing other people's screens, watching television at other people's homes and in other people's homes. So the act of having a television set is, we both know it's not socially neutral, it's not politically neutral. It can be a bad thing, it could be a good thing, it could be something in between. Even looking at photographs I've noticed of the proliferation of the TV entering homes, you see how the living room itself changes in terms of the
Interesting.
where they're oriented. So I want to ask about your relationship to television and what has that changed over the years? Do you have a first memory of reality TV? Anything like that?
Yeah, I think those are such good points, and I really, really like what you were saying about kind of in the States particularly, but in a lot of places, but it's really prominent in the States, that idea of you work really, really, really hard and there's still no security or safety or no kind of let up, and that idea that previously you sold labor for security. Maybe you worked for a company or you were a tradesperson, and that meant that you were kind of set and the possibility of promotion or a better job. Whereas now, kind of under neoliberalism, the idea is that you sell yourself and that there can never be any real security or comfort when you sell yourself. And I think in television and reality television, it's all this massive projection of it. And kind of to link your kind of 2 points, I loved scripted dramas growing up, and also would watch the VHS tapes, and that was a great comfort. But also, what was always on in the background were reality television shows, and something I think is particularly interesting of just how prevalent they were kind of like quiz shows or game shows where someone spins a wheel and they win a car, or you answer 10 questions and you win £1 million possibly, and all of these different things, as well as shows like Big Brother. And I think that even though I never really kind of sat down to watch Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or Big Brother. I think that idea is so interesting to me that, Orwell presented this total nightmare situation where Big Brother is watching you, and we said, fun, let's do that every night at 9 o'clock, and let's just keep it going, and, as much as we can. And not only do I want to watch it, I want to do it because, again, what you were saying, that idea of working hard doesn't really account for much comfort. The idea that people aren't offered £1 million for answering 10 questions correctly. They're offered it for answering them and being on television. And so there's this idea that being monitored or being surveyed equates monetization, income, reward. And as you were saying, it is really frustrating when you see people who work really hard and do really meaningful work that keeps society together. And these are the people who are struggling to pay their bills. And then you go online and you see someone say, thank you for this blush, and they're on crazy money. And this isn't a condemnation as much of the influencer, but rather the kind of situation that has necessitated it. But something that I think makes reality television so particularly interesting in the neoliberal nightmare is that, yes, there's this kind of idea of being seen and the possibility of money. But in order to get there, there's an important middle step, which is self-branding. Someone doesn't go on to Love Island, again, I'm using Love Island as an example here, because they want I don't know how much is it at the end, like 50K or something like that. Like, and they're also certainly not going on it for love. I'm sorry. They're just, maybe there's an exception, but I
What?
think, yeah. But the real kind of possibility there is that you spend the time there building a personal brand. And this doesn't mean kind of doing business in the villa. It simply means that you are performing yourself, that you are offering yourself as a product, and that at the end, the version of yourself that has been projected is a product to be bought afterwards. And there's a lot of people who came off these shows and had a really, really horrible time. And there's a number of people who died by suicide. And again, it's become this kind of metaphor for the way that we live, that you have to sell yourself in order to have this kind of easy, comfortable life, that this is the kind of quickest way to do it. That, just like Lily kind of thinks, like, why would I want to labor for hours and hours every day for work that she doesn't find meaningful, only to still be skint, when she could say thank you to a brand and have comfort for a long time. But I know, Alex, that you have done so much work kind of dissecting these, social norms and these kind of horribly, capitalist ideas. So I know you have loads of thoughts on it. So I'd be interested as well to hear kind of your relationship to television in that regard.
Well, the thing is so I turn 18 and then I'm given access to YouTube. I'm given access to these things. But that was at the beginning of a very brief but super intense educational world where I was now out of my homeschool classical education co-op world, very hippie, into this very systematic boarding school higher education world. It was still Socratic, but it was busy, busy, busy. So I didn't even at that time engage with any television or any screen. There just simply wasn't time. But like you, the pandemic happens and you're in this bubble with people and you're working from home, you're doing all these things. I was a nanny at the time too. So I had within my bubble, this kid would go back and forth. I was a foster parent as well. And I would be so brain dead at the end of the day that the idea of doing anything particularly difficult was just so on the bottom of my list that I started watching Love is Blind with a group of people and then we would talk about it. And that to me was so fascinating to see how these resources that were prized and valued in my social circle, like marriage, the love story, having children, things that I had heard about from The Bachelor, because I would listen to a podcast on it, even though I didn't watch it, to see how they were put in this game setting and how that wasn't actually that crazy. And people in my circle would say, oh, this is a mockery of marriage. This is very untraditional. But as someone who studied history, this seemed incredibly traditional. It just seemed that now we had a far easier access to discuss it and look at it, because back in the day you might sit around and gossip about what you're seeing down the road. You might talk about whose value went up and down and who got an extra cow and who got this land, so now their dowry was going to be greater. So to me, I was like, wait, this is not all that different. And this is quite fascinating to watch, because these people, like the founder of reality TV for America, Alan Funt, said, they're constantly being caught in the act of being themselves. They're so much more revealing of things we actually believe that we don't want to talk about. We know we're not supposed to talk about money. We know we're not supposed to talk about sex. We know we're not supposed to compare our relationships, but we do. And these people are just being caught doing it. And it brought up a lot of questions and this opportunity for me to be able to say, all that boring sociology and history about gender, race, and class that is not working when I just talk about that on TikTok or talk about that online. People know these stories and they have these distinct feelings about what they're seeing. And they don't know why they feel that way. They're not connecting those dots, especially because in the States, we sanitize our history. We want to separate people from a history of the people to give them the history of the state. And we look at people's lived experiences and the outcomes that they have in their relationships with either money or people. And we say that's the product of simply individual choices. And while that can be the case, this game or this scramble for this form of meritocracy where people get certain things because they're worthy of it, it's not entirely true. And we would catch that if we connected it to our history. So for me, that was my sneaky way in, was like, oh, everyone's watching this. They're talking about it. This is how I can educate people on this, or answer the questions that I kept answering individually in text. Let me just put it in a video. My mom encouraged me to, because I did not think long form media was ever going to be a thing on social media. And as much as my social media has changed from my personal account, because similar to you, I just stopped, I've way scaled back on that. It has become a more connective, how can we talk about this? We're already looking at this. This is already impacting us whether we watch it or not. So we might as well talk back to it, which is what either as a writer or someone who writes for social media can do. Um, I would say, though, my relationship to reality TV is very, like you said, it's very critical, because there's no way you can look at this and not think about how, yes, there's a trade happening, but the trade isn't always entirely fair, especially because, as we see in your novel too, there's always these asymmetrical forms of power, whether that's asymmetric distribution of information, there's asymmetric distribution of resources. The things people use to gain those resources are sometimes not anything they could do on their own, like Lily being as beautiful as she is, even though it's commented that she does a lot of work to look that way. All of these people, in a way, a show like Love Island or The Compound, it does have to discriminate to even get to a place where there's this competition or this so-called meritocracy, because they're not casting certain people in there. They're not casting people of different abilities. They're not casting people who are not conventionally attractive. And there is also, of course, which we'll talk about later, this whole performance of gender. So that is my response to your question on that, because I don't know how people, and I've been hearing this a lot, I don't know how people just watch these shows and then that's it, which might sound judgmental, but the shows make me furious when I'm watching them. I don't know, was that your experience when you first started watching Love Island?
First of all, I love your answer. That was fascinating. Thank you. Um, yeah, I remember, I'm afraid I kind of went into it originally with a kind of judgmental lens that kind of melted away and then came back, if that makes sense.
Yes, it
But
does.
I had I had finished my first year of college and I went back home for the summer and there wasn't really a lot to do. And my friend was saying, "Oh, everyone's watching Love Island." And I was kind of saying, "What is it?" And about a week into it, I watched the first episode and I remember going over to my friend's house and saying, "That Love Island, it's so interesting." I was like, "It's such a fascinating character study and it's so psychological that, people do these crazy things, but then they explain their motivations to the character, to the camera even. It's such an in-depth look at the human psyche." And I remember so clearly she looked at me with such disgust and she was like, "It's a bit of crack, like it's a bit of fun, like you're not getting it." But I
You're
totally
missing it.
understand her perspective in that I think there's a way to do both, to kind of have fun and also, maybe question some of the things that we're seeing.
Yes.
But yeah, that was kind of my way in.
Because we can't, like, how do I say this? I am very aware this is definitely a romp and a fun time because this is not like watching 1914. I'm aware that there's a huge difference, and me sitting down to watch this in the evening to take notes is very different from the work it would take me when my professor would say, "Okay, there's this treaty, this happened during the Revolutionary War. I need you to read the whole thing and then write something on." It's very different work. We can both understand that. But like you said, at the same time, if you're looking for patterns and if you are fascinated by how, I think this is what is probably most fascinating for my audience too, they are so intrigued by how quickly the cast turn into islanders, and then those islanders turn into people who have a shared language, they have shared rules, they have these ideas around what certain terms mean and what happens if you violate that. There's a code of morals and a code of behavior that, yes, can be consistent and be built upon throughout the seasons, but each cast, they bring their own elements of that with them, and each season has its own little world in that way. And that harkens back to you talking about how you pitched the compound with the idea of the Lord of the Flies in mind, where this society that these children form, it works until it doesn't, and then there's this moment where the spell is broken, where people get off and or they're rescued. And I'm noticing that there's something similar with After Sun, because After Sun has changed over the years. You wouldn't probably be aware of this now, but in the US, the After Sun brings on the dumped candidates, cast members, and they give them back their phones. And this is something that they used to do, but they wouldn't film it. So now we are also having this additional layer of watching people leave the society, be reintroduced back into society, and then how their calculations change in real time when they see the audience feedback. So we just actually watched, or what I heard of, because I actually cannot physically watch all of the After Sun. It's too much work. I have another job too. But there's this case where this couple comes off. She's clearly has not been interested in him. She was holding on to him to save herself and stay in the villa. They get dumped. They're given back their phones. And we watch as this woman realizes how much social currency her couple, the man in her couple, has. And you see as the interview goes on, she shifts how she's talking about the future with him, how she talks about him. There's this interest. He's, of course, checked out because he knows what's happening. But to watch that calculation happen, the show's over, like the game's over. But in a way, it's not, because the game continues in order to have social relevance, to have access to partnerships and money and things like that. So I know you've missed that because you're now in your own bubble of peace in some way, but that's what's happening now.
So cruel. That makes me so sad. Yeah, I do wonder where the line is drawn. Like, when is it too awful? Like, I definitely remember every year that I was watching it, a new record was broken for the number of complaints, and it was usually around emotional manipulation. But every year it just was kind of allowed to continue until people were dying, and it was kind of thought maybe we're being a bit mean, and this idea of maybe we should look after the contestants afterwards. But that feels particularly cruel. I mean, look, I can't really judge because I haven't seen it, so but it sounds mean.
You can say that because it's a production choice. It's a structural production choice. And it's actually fascinating to hear you have that immediate sense that this is cruel and mean. When I heard that, and I 2 days ago was like, oh, that's fantastic television. That
Yeah. Well, both can be true, yeah.
I'm now like, oh, wait, why didn't I must be immersed in it now, where I'm thinking, oh, they're finding ways to cover more ground and to squeeze as much content as they can out of these people, even on their way out. They don't want to lose a dollar. But that leads in then to the next question. Why, especially for those of us who are watching and now, I guess, in the cult, why is that sad, and what concerns you most about, now this might be too broad. What is concerning you most about reality television like this, especially when you hear things like that?
I think exactly what we're talking about, humans as forms of exploitation is sad, but I also think that kind of pain as entertainment is difficult, and kind of I wonder if it chips away at our sense of empathy. But in a broader sense, I do wonder as well about reality television, not just normalizing, but again, glamorizing surveillance, and that we're so used to this concept of being watched 24/7, and that it's fun in the sun, or that there's the possibility of reward or fame or money or clout, and that those are the ideas that are being attached to surveillance. And that I do wonder if that makes it all the easier for us to click allow all cookies and not think about it. And that also, influencing is just another version of reality television, and that like you're selling a version of yourself, and that this is normalized, and that even the people who don't make profit on it still kind of feel compelled to push a version of themselves. And I just think that kind of, I know I talked about it before, but just the element of personal branding just feels so insidious to me. And that if I were to watch one of those shows, and again, I'm using Love Island as the frame of reference, you immediately see, hi, I'm Mary, I'm 22, I'm from so and so, and my dream is to be X, Y, and Z. And this feels so unnecessary. It is so much a kind of, it's just branding immediately, in that yes, it feels like information that you would see maybe on a dating profile, which is itself a sort of market. But if I were to start watching, The Pit, and there's 20 characters I've never seen before, I don't need the lead actor to turn to the camera and say, hi, I'm Dr. Robbie.
No.
Because that's not, we understand people by how they act, what they say, and how they treat each other, and that is life. And it's kind of ironic that reality television, which is kind of an illusion of that it's pretending to be what is true, does so much more to create what feels like a market. Truly, it's really that things are being bought and sold, and that you're culpable in that market. You allow people to become popular and to become successful afterwards. Similarly, there are things that people see, and whether it's cultural biases or just a kind of human sense of dislike, we think, I don't like that, I want them gone, I don't like what they've done. And we kind of have this power to promote ideas in people or aesthetics in people, which is also worrying. That certainly when I was watching it, it felt that every season there was a beautiful black woman who was cast to the side, and this happened again and again and again. And there was always this kind of head scratching of, why is this happening? And then all of the men would say, I think my type is, let me think, blonde and blue eyes. And you're kind of wondering how this situation arose, that it's all constructed by us. It's the producers, and it's the participants, and it's the viewers. But I think, just to get back to your question, mostly I do think that kind of reality television, the biggest detriment is this idea that we are all kind of inevitably pushed to self brand because we know that we're being watched or monitored or surveyed in either minor ways or really, really major ways, and that it's kind of made us all duplicitous in the system, I guess.
I'm wondering if the self branding, the wariness around the self branding, comes from, because I guess it's different across the continents and the different countries. Because in the States, you're aware there's no safety net, there's nothing there, so you eat what you can catch and kill, and it all comes down to you. And I'm wondering if this idea that, listen, if you don't have something, it's because you don't deserve it and you didn't brand and you didn't do what you needed to do. And I don't even know how to ask this. I might have to come back to this because I'm also, you're challenging me to think, especially the book too, when we kept going back to how Lily was leaning on really selling the gifts that she received, and how those there was that, yes, this very real element of like, there's nothing in this compound. They have what they do, what they get when they win those communal tasks and when they do those personal challenges. So we as the reader, we do have that sympathy of like, yeah, she's got to hustle to get the things, to get stuff. But then you show us that there's this point where it's like, you continue to do these different humiliations or these different rituals and these different things, and you're getting stuff that's not necessary for survival, and it's actually damaging your relationship to other people in the house for you to have this trinket or this thing that has no bearing on whether or not down the line you guys will have water or you'll have the ability to store your food properly. So that was fascinating to watch too, because it both, your novel both introduces, yes, this is the very human impulse we have to gather these shiny things, but also that almost this kind of self-betrayal or community betrayal that comes from just, oh, I can acquire as much as possible, there's no end to what I can require. If I could sell out as many people as possible, okay, then I'm going to take that tact. And we're now starting to see that on Love Island, in that there are people who were besties with people that are now trying to sow doubt or make the compromise the other couples so that they have a better standing themselves, which is a very cynical thing to watch as an audience member. But I did want to not miss out, since I've brought it back to like the challenges in the novel and the challenges that are happening on the screen, and you brought that up yourself. One of my listeners asked me to ask you, what do you think about the nature of the challenges that you presented in the compound? And I'm guessing she was also asking, what do you think about the nature of the challenges in a show like Love Island? Especially because Love Island is different from, say, The Bachelor or some of these other game shows we've talked about, where they build a narrative for the character. They do a lot of that branding, less of the self branding. They really have a handle on how often you see the character, they cameras go down. But unlike this situation with Love Island and the compound, like you said, the cameras are on all the time. So what do you think about the nature of all of those challenges?
Yeah, I think maybe my kind of unstudied response to it on the shows is that it just feels like a kind of torture tactic, and particularly that they kind of feign the reason that they do these challenges is to kind of pretend at intimacy, in that it's, oh, like, I don't know, the heart rate challenge, or quizzes on each other that are supposed to bring them closer together but inevitably creates rifts and all these kind of embarrassment and pain and discontent that is their discontent is our gain. It kind of feels that it's viewership, and that's why it's done in the name supposedly of intimacy. Just feels particularly ironic. But I think for the compound, I did just want to particularly look at the total disparity between kind of value and worth and labour and reward, in that they do often pretty silly tasks or just kind of meaningless gestures in order to receive something. And sometimes it's to embarrass, the participants, but sometimes it's also to reveal something about the participants, and that, we don't know what their jobs are for a very long time, and that, this is a task at one point. So it's kind of that, again, they are being mined, the characters and the contestants. They are kind of everything that they have to offer, they will offer. But in the case of a kind of minor spoiler, it happens relatively early that one of the tasks is to hold their breath underwater for 1 minute. And I kind of was humbled when I was reading it, and I kind of thought, okay, I'm just going to hold my breath for a minute as I write this. And I literally was sitting like on a chair, and I was feeling really panicked. So I liked the idea of this happening kind of early on and sowing the seeds of panic, and particularly this kind of setting the precedent of what they were willing to do. But specifically that in that scene, one of the characters, Becca, struggles with it, and a very strong character and domineering character, Tom, pushes her head under the water. But the justification for this was that the reward was a couch. And his logic was, what are we going to do? Not have a couch? Like, this was really, it just wasn't conceivable to him that they would live in a house where there's no couch. And therefore, of course, he would force her underwater and do these things. And that they kind of, in a way, they do self-direct a lot, and that there's nothing to say that they had to do this task. They would have gotten on just fine with one less seat in the house. But these are the things that we kind of do to justify having a comfortable life, and not just the work that we do or the labor that we do, but the kind of, maybe the way we treat people, or the things that we see going on in society, whether it's in, politics or in culture, or whether it's our very neighbours. We see that and we allow that for a comfortable life, and that Tom is the person who forces her underwater, but Lily is the one who stands there, and she kind of feels, well, what choice did I have? But she absolutely had a choice, and she was complicit in that decision. And in a way, the reader and viewer is complicit in a way too, that if we really felt that those challenges were cruel beyond reason, we could stop them. It's not a force beyond our control, but there is a kind of dark desire in us, I think, to see suffering if it brings us some joy or comfort. It's sad.
It is. And I'm wondering how much of it has to do with we feel a sense of lack of agency in our own lives. And we feel like what we have, the moral judgments we cast, or the ideas we wish we could see, or the way we want to hold people accountable, we feel so powerless in other very important avenues, because you watch people like Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg make these decisions in these states that are digital that have impact on the real life state. I guess you can't even say real life state, in the physical national state that's, say, part of diplomatic treaties, whereas Facebook and X, they operate as countries with no accord, no commitment or responsibility to the other states that they interact with or that they undermine. And I've noticed that there's such a moral, and I feel this in myself too, the thrill of being able to cast judgment on what I'm seeing on screen, or to catch out somebody being duplicitous on the show, or to point and go, aha, like that person is using that other person for their gain and entertainment. I'm sitting right there with my snack, excited. I know that at the end of the day, with my boyfriend, I have watched Hell's Kitchen and laughed my head off at somebody burning something that was their final straw. So yeah, it does. There's another character in the compound, and it's the audience that doesn't turn the television off, the audience that is there receiving all the product placement. So that's a really important thing to remember. Now, I do want to ask you about your interest in the gender politics that happen not only in the compound, but in programming like this, because I have noticed that we think we've come really far in terms of gender politics, or how we allow people to be individuals. But One thing that has become so clear is that when you enter a show like this, or when you're, say, you're Lily in the compound, there are very strict rules about you can't couple up with another woman to save your skin, right? There's a compulsory heteronormity to some of these challenges or these competitions because you need to partner up in a mixed orientation monogamous couple. Like you can't have three people who are like, well, we're together, so we're safe. And you also have people having to perform beauty labor or the like on Love Island, there's a lot of the men do the breakfasts now. They bring breakfast. And if a woman fails in a certain way, there's the threat of not receiving a breakfast. Like if you're not a good enough woman or you're not the type of woman people are interested in, you might not get your breakfast. But you never see the girls down there making the breakfast. And it's the girl's job to appear like you don't see anyone in a tankini. No one is showing up in a full cotton, oh my gosh, the sun's out, I'm going to wear a full sleeve shirt. Like you have to be in your bikini. But again, these are artificial. These are constructions of production. And then this social fear that I'm going to lose audience of affirmation, I'm going to lose the cast's affirmation. So what were you thinking about in terms of gender politics when you wrote this novel?
Yeah, I really, really like those points. And just kind of jumping on what you were saying there about the girls kind of performing beauty and the kind of labor that goes into that, and the men kind of doing their like provider bit of bringing them coffees in bed. I find that so funny and so interesting. But it is again, it's a market. They are participating in a market and they are always, every single morning, reasserting their value in that market. And every time a bombshell comes in and it's like a new iPhone coming, it's like, how is it different? I don't know, but it's new and I want it. And suddenly everyone else's value kind of plummets because of it. But in terms of that kind of gender divide and gender performance, I suppose I kind of wanted to take visuals and feelings of the shows that were familiar and kind of take away the sexy aspect and just kind of make it more sinister. As you were saying, that the girls don't feel that they can cover up and that they always have to be projecting this idea of desirability. And similarly, the men spend so much of the day in the gym and they're often shirtless. And something that was particularly interesting to me was that in some ways across the centuries or millennia, nothing has changed, in that one of the reasons that women are continuously subjugated is the threat of violence, and that because of that biological advantage, nothing can really change, and that Lily gets into an altercation with Tom. I'm just gonna go out and spoil it.
Yeah, we're in spoiler territory,
We're
people.
in
So
spoiler.
yeah, that we're good. We're good.
That Becca particularly has this kind of desire for vengeance against Tom, who has wronged her, and I personally think that Becca becomes one of the worst people on the show, or kind of betrays herself the most, because she is the person who would be the most critical of these people and these devices. And she is the one who hoards the most valuable resource in the desert, which is water. And she forces the men to become very sick. And this kind of cruelty that came out in her is a very, very capitalist feeling of, I'm going to take this resource and I'm going to be richer because of it. And that even though Becca and Lily kind of conspire to kind of, I don't want to say defeat the men, but to better the men, and in some regards they are successful, it all becomes moot because Tom is physically stronger, and that he overpowers Becca, threatens to do the same to Lily, and that any clever machinations that they came across are meaningless in the face of his brutality, and that he could be, if he wanted to be Tom, a really useful, constructive force in the community because he has that strength. And there was a quote that was kind of rattling around in my head a lot as I was writing, from Measure for Measure, where Shakespeare says, "Oh, it is wonderful to have a giant's strength, but it is tyrannous to use it like a giant." And that Tom, again, because their living is so dependent on the work of the community being so strong, because they have to literally like build a shed and all of this, that is so valuable, and he uses it for ill. But this kind of idea that constantly the dynamics in dating that we see as sexy are just as easily seen as sinister, I think. And that I kind of was interested in the idea of like a first date, where you haven't met someone, and maybe you're in a restaurant together or you're in a car together or whatever, you're kind of in this somewhat enclosed space with a real stranger, and even if it's just a walk in the park, it is a kind of intimate position to be in, and that is kind of thrilling on one hand and really terrifying on another. And that's why I wanted to have a stripped back kind of backstory for all the characters, and that you're not allowed to know their personal lives, and this was terrifying as well. And that one of the first scenes, when the men arrive, they're so kind of glad to see the women, because they feel that being with women equals being civilized, which is in itself worrying. But there's kind of an image where which I kind of had taken from these shows, where the men are in front of the women and they're all just staring so lustfully at them. And Lily has the thought that they might either drop to their knees in adoration, or, you know, knock them all into the pool, like do something really brutal or violent, and that you kind of see the potential for both always, and that the longer they're there and the more kind of sinister and greedy it all becomes, the more their kind of base desires come out. And yeah, so I do think in the compound those gender dynamics are really dialed up to 11. You know, I don't think that that's you know, the Toms in life are hopefully few and far between, but I do think that that kind of thread of violence is kind of inescapable, and it has shaped so much of how women behave in everything that they do.
It felt real because every social setting is constructed, whether it's the compound, the villa, wherever we are. And like you said, I was about this trust where you have to, in order to be in society, in order to even have the risk of something good, you are putting yourself in a vulnerable position to run into a bad actor or someone who will use that opportunity, that social opportunity, that trust, that desire for connection to dominate and to just hoard. And balancing that and having that, there's always that threat of violence in every single society where we have these rules because there are people who, if they weren't there and they had the opportunity, they would just hoard. They would hoard all sorts of things. They would hoard bodies, they would hoard resources, they would hoard power. And then you have, like you said, this that flip side of, well, we could have a good life. We could, it is possible to build a peaceful life in the compound. But like you said, it would require all those different strengths, all those different attributes to work together and want the good of the whole or the collective as opposed to the individual. And then when fear enters the picture, or scarcity, the illusion of scarcity enters the picture, all of that changes. And we know that production knows that the most drama is in the scarcity and in what you withhold and what you give and how you pit people against each other. So I do want to ask you about information asymmetry, which we touched on earlier, and how you thought of the producers, which are the silent character, and how they withhold information or how they drop information, or even how the characters in relating to each other, they spend a good chunk of the time unable to, like you said, plumb the depths of their own individual context and why they're there in the first place.
It's the idea of information asymmetry is so interesting, and it does reassert the idea that, you know, information and knowledge and data is a resource, and a very, very valuable one, and we know more than anyone in, you know, the 21st century that data is the most valuable kind of asset going. But also in a kind of storytelling aspect, you know, dramatic irony is a kind of literary technique, oh, a tale as old as time, oh, he knows this, but she doesn't know this. And so it feels, again, kind of fun and sinister at the same time. But I think Lily is kind of funny in that she has a real desire to kind of tune out. She kind of really doesn't want to interrogate some of the kind of the structures in place too closely. But one of the things that she is forced to consider in terms of the outward perception is, why is Tom still there? And that is a question of the producers and the audience, and that there's something in him that really appeals to the masses, even though he's like a violent psychopath, that there's some performance of masculinity that's really, really appealing. And she kind of wonders then, is she there solely as a kind of female fantasy, or is she there to be a jester in the court of the king, that people not only want to see a performance of hypermasculinity, but to see her subjugated under Tom's thumb? But the kind of idea of drop feeding in information, and some of these are, very small things, and some of them are more important, again, things like their job, or, there's small pieces of information creates kind of ripple effects where there is a question of how many people have they slept with in the compound. And for me, I think that Candace kind of should have been the winner, but this was the thing that kind of dethroned her. I also think that Candace is kind of, if Tom is the kind of most powerful man, Candace is the most powerful woman, in that her capital is her beauty. But unlike Tom, Candace has the power and doesn't use it for ill, in that she actually wants to share the compound with Lily, and she says, well, I don't want to live here alone. I think me and you and Tom, or Ryan and Andrew could live together really happily. But when that task is revealed, that Andrew has been sleeping around, she feels that, and again, it's that thing you were talking about of information asymmetry, that not only has she kind of been cheated on, but that everyone else knew and she doesn't, and that makes her the butt of the joke, which is something that her kind of pride just will not allow. She's not, any power that she had is gone because of that. And so I think she was really right to leave at that point. And unfortunately, I think for all the characters, they have a desire specific to them, and each desire is kind of derealized when they leave or just before they leave. And in Candace, she wanted to be the most desirable, and then learning that Andrew had been sleeping around, this was kind of ridiculed, and so it was her time to go. But it is interesting in any group, whether it's a group of friends, or it's a workplace, or it's a micro society like this, the kind of withholding and trickling in of information is seismic, and it's fascinating to see how people react.
Right. It what reading the compound and then also watching the element of movie night, and how we don't necessarily even need a producer to pull someone aside and suggest something like has happened in, say, Survivor or The Bachelor. You just drop either photos or little clips, and you let the people put the pieces together and then talk amongst themselves. And that changes this order of who's safe and who's not safe. It's fascinating because it is what is happening in our own lives, and we do this amongst ourselves. That said, when we're talking about point of view, and I have a couple questions around your choice too, because in a way I'm almost bundling some of these questions. This choice about making Lily the protagonist, you obviously had the opportunity to do multiple points of view. You could have gone between producer, Candace, Tom, Lily, or you could have taken a complete, like we could have been watching it as if we were the audience too. This decision to make Lily the singular point of view, and Lily is not Becca, who is there for the supposedly more noble reason of critiquing the structure of the compound or someone who's there for just a good time. Lily has very specific desires and hopes pinned onto the compound, and she is the person who brings us into the situation from beginning to end. So, what was going into that decision for you?
I think for the reason for having it just one POV and being in the first person was I wanted this feeling of total immersion, that you never leave the compound and that you never experience anything but one point of view. And that because we're only seeing one point of view, our version of reality is Lily's version of reality. And if we were, for example, to like switch halfway through to, Becca or the producers or someone else, that version of reality is immediately kind of destroyed, and that no one experiences life the same way, right? And so I also thought that for Lily, in that, Lily is kind of the not the obvious choice for the protagonist here, and that, as you were saying, it's more common for the Becca to be the protagonist, the kind of brainy one who has the kind of insights and the capacity and the desire to interrogate things that the reader might also want to interrogate. But I kind of liked the idea of, Becca says to Lily at some point, like, I don't need to know why you chose to be on the show. This show was made for you. So I did kind of feel that in order to really get to the root of the desire for this life, the life of kind of easy living where comfort is prioritized over the kind of ethics or kind of ethical consumption, as well as the desire for fame, that we needed to be with the kind of stereotypical version there. And that also, I think that if this were not a book but a TV show and we were tuning in every night, I think we wouldn't think much of Billy. I think we discount her almost immediately. And that was interesting to me. It kind of felt for me like an exercise in empathy to kind of dismantle some of my own judgments, that there's no such thing. I kind of hear this idea of that person has a rich inner life. Everyone has a rich inner life. I don't think, certainly some people are kind of able to present their thoughts in a way which is really eloquent and interesting, but everyone has a fantastically rich time inside their head. And so it was kind of fun for me to consider this in a slightly detached way, that Lily views things, and that we kind of see her go on a journey from this really kind of disassociated, she's just kind of interested in how people view her and what the kind of possible gain is, to becoming quite a vicious person, and a personality that comes out in her that's necessitated by the harshness of the landscape and the people that she's stuck with. But I do think it would be interesting to see a Becca POV.
Yeah, but at the same, like you said, this reminder that everybody has a rich inner life. And sometimes we watch these shows or we look at people in friend groups, we go, that's the boring one. This one is not bringing anything to the show. But it is almost more terrifying, scary, intriguing to think about the type of person or mindset that you're, like you said, fits perfectly into the game, who is attracted to the game, who is, because Lily is not a cynic per se. She's a cynic of the outside world and her understanding of like how much she can take from that. But she's almost in a way a true believer, in that she comes to the compound believing that the compound can give her, like you said, that easy life, that good life. And that, as you sit with, not sit, as you follow her, that becomes more terrifying over time, especially as the dream starts to disintegrate, or the cost of that dream. Maybe the dream doesn't disintegrate because guess what? You find yourself at the end and the game's not broken. The rules have not changed. She is getting what she wants. She is shockingly the winner. But the reality and the cost of being that winner is painful in a way I guess she didn't. I mean, you might disagree with that. I don't know if it's that a way she didn't consider. But before we get more into that, I did want to ask you about that context that Lily is aware of, even as someone might call her an NPC or a boring character. She's aware that she is in a world that has a kind of vague forever war, that she's in a society where she's not super connected to her mom, she's not super connected to like this thriving village. Why did you want to include that instead of just making the terror about like, oh, it's a survivor game or a sports game? Part of the terror is what she's leaving to look for here. And then I guess the second part of that question is the choice to make it vague and to not go into endless detail about the political landscape.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, first of all, I wanted the kind of intensity of the inside to be justified by the outside, and that, they do kind of crazy things, and this idea that, you know, is it really worth it for a couch, or is it really worth it for diamond earrings, or whatever? And that also, that what you were seeing on the outside, or what you were seeing on the inside, was the problems of the outside, and that it's resource hoarding, it's kind of contested ideas of ownership, it's, conflict that ends in violence, and kind of the rise of tyranny a little bit in the compound. But I didn't want to bring it in too much because I thought the idea of a kind of background hum of existential dread, which it feels that we all kind of sludge through every day, felt more sinister and insidious than the idea of Lily saying, I am here because of X, Y, and Z. But also, the other thing was that I wanted life in this reality TV show to be what felt like real life. And that real reality that wasn't constructed, that wasn't being sold to consumers, was kind of just something that's on in the background that Lily's not really interested in engaging in, to just kind of flip it around. And the idea of kind of buying a reality which suits you, and in the way that we live now with so much information accessible to us, we kind of have to question and decide every day how much we choose to engage or disengage in order to make living feel that we're both aware of the context that we're in, but also that we can kind of have the strength to get through day to day. And for Lily, her decision is, I'm not engaging at all. I don't want to think about it. That's none of my business. What's real is right here. And the longer she's there, I mean, Lily doesn't like to tell us much anyway, but the longer she's there, she kind of stops thinking in memories outside of the show, and her memories become memories of the show. And that she's thinking, oh, well, I remember on this season they did this, and oh, in this season they did this, rather than thinking about friends or family. This is the kind of only reality that she wants. And yes, it's Stockholm Syndrome, but it's also, she just feels that this is the life that's beneficial. This feels more rewarding, and therefore, why would she even consider that hardship from before?
Now, I want to talk about the worthiness aspect, and also the fact that we start with everybody really in a friendly summer camp way. It's very summery vibe of like, oh, we're all here and this is fun. And people know, yes, eliminations are coming. But my audience and I have been talking about historian, I guess more film critic Emily Nussbaum, and how when she recounts how the British product that is Survivor became an American blockbuster product, that first season is the only season in which the contestants are really grappling with who is the best survivor, who is worthy of that financial prize, who deserves this. And I read some of her interviews with the cast later where they said it was only after the show ended they were like, it's all a game, it's all there wasn't really anybody who was most worthy of winning that prize. But when we were in it, we were very concerned with that question, and we believed in that meritocracy. And it is a great irony that the most hated, most devious person ended up winning that season and was not necessarily beloved by America. But in an outside economy, and even in the economy that happens in the compound, a lot of your characters start out thinking like, oh, we can do this together. We will play fair. Now, I'm not saying Tom or certain people, like, we weren't in their minds, but there's this moment where Lily talks about how she believes that they will be different, or that this piece will just continue, and that there's no way anything else, it could go downhill from here because they are going to work together. And I like that because so much of the classic literature that we are assigned now, as we get generations further and further from the time in which it was written, it is very easy to look at those characters and go, well, that was back then. That take, or that grapple with the veneer of civility versus the brutality underneath, that was another time. So, what do you hope people in this modern setting remember about that, those, how we kind of trick ourselves or have this illusion of fairness? Because it's a very different situation for your characters when they have full bellies and they have access to water and there is a little bit of AC, than later when those things start to dwindle.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the kind of Lord of the Flies aspect that appealed to me so much was the kind of eventual revelation of the darkness of man's heart, which it just makes me so sad, even just thinking specifically Lord of the Flies. And that, it's, and something Mary Renault said, which I loved, is the good man is he who will not awaken in himself or others. And I think I'm getting that quote slightly wrong, but the idea that they kind of contaminate each other. But in the context of the compound, something that was kind of fun to deal with was the house as a landscape and as a society, in that they are, each season is a generation of people, and that when Lily and her cohort arrive, they're really uneasy to see the state that the house is in, and they see trash, and they see that some of the furniture has been ruined. And again, Lily doesn't want to think about this, but it definitely creates this feeling of, what did they do, and why do they not look after the place? And she sees there's like rotting fruit and that there's kind of things left out, and she's thinking, why did they leave in such a hurry? But as is the case with each generation, there's this certainty that we're not going to be like the people who came before us. We are going to leave this house in a better place than when we found it. And yet, Lily did not inherit the place in a good way. And when Lily leaves it, she leaves the house far worse than when she found it. They've literally burned the grounds to a crisp. And as well as that, Andrew has created a disastrously ugly monument to their literal greed that he thinks is, he thinks that's going to be their legacy. But that desire that we see again and again, that they live in a really unforgiving landscape, and they feel that the ecological reality is so close that this unforgiving desert is really only just a couple of meters away from them, and the harshness of the desert. But for most of the time they think, I'm in an oasis, what do I care about the desert? Until their greed forces them to really grapple with it. But I do think that when it comes to a marketplace, which they are in the compound, where everything is about the price of resources and the relative kind of value that they're placing on it, they're going to become these greedy, materialistic people. Of course they are. And that's the society that we're in, and that's the society that they're in. It's just a kind of heightened version of it. I think in terms of the takeaway, this is a satire of reality television, but the thing that I kind of most wanted to talk about was the pitfalls of consumerism, and this feeling that enough is never enough, that we never have a point where we think I'll never need to buy anything ever again, or I'll never need for anything more. There's always something else, and it doesn't bring any happiness. And that Lily, Lily just wants to not have to labor and to be comfortable. But sorry, I'm quoting again. You can cut out all these quotes.
No, no, please.
I have no original thoughts, just thinking about.
No, you.
There's a Thomas More poem, The Last Rose of Summer, and in the final verse he talks about, you know, what happens when friendship falls away and loved ones are gone. And he says, who would inhabit this bleak world alone? And that Lily has been gifted with this beautiful house and everything she could possibly want ever, but it tires so quickly, and that her desire and the reality of the situation don't match and never have correlated really, and that she goes in search of human connection, which is the real valuable thing that Sam kind of told her and she ignored because she had to kind of learn the lesson, as they all do, before she kind of got it. So yeah, I think for me, the kind of the marriage of, reality television and consumerism, it was kind of what I wanted to talk about. But also, I hear myself talking, and I'm so happy for people to read it and just kind of escape for a couple of hours, and that's totally happy for me. I don't feel that anyone needs to take away a certain thing or to feel a certain way about it.
I was grateful for it because it has been a long, long time since I've opened a book and then not gotten up until it was done. And the number of people who told me it was the same thing for me. I started it and I couldn't put it down. I was like, oh, which is why later we've got to ask about your writing process. But that thread that you just brought up about the relationship that Lily is offered with Sam or some of these other people, but particularly we see that idea articulated in the character of Sam. And I was thinking, as I was wondering what she was going to choose, if she was going to really start to invest in that relationship and choose him and maybe leave with him when he left, as opposed to staying on. There's an element in Love Island where you get to choose between keeping the 100,000 or splitting it and getting 50, which is why people think, oh, it's a $50,000 prize. Well, that's only if you do the noble thing of splitting the prize with your partner. You do have the opportunity to just take all of the money. And of course, people don't, because that would hurt their brand safety down the line. But in this case, we have a character who, she struggles, but she ultimately chooses the compound initially. And it does bring up probably that dreaded question that I almost don't even want to ask about the unlikable female character, or the character who, in a way, is complicated enough or flawed enough to follow something other than what we would expect, right? This novel doesn't end with her running off into the sunset and just like getting this fantastic epiphany in the compound. There's this awareness that's building, but that's not how that relationship with Sam ends while they're both still there. So what did you think about that choice, and maybe the burden in a way that you were putting on Lily to make her very realistic in that way?
Yeah, I think the conversation around unlikable kind of female narrators is so interesting, and it's really complicated, I think, in that, I mean, just the very obvious backdrop is that, literature is flooded with unlikable men, and it really never was an issue and kind of never is an issue. And I also do kind of question ideas of presentations of likable women, books and film, and that there's kind of a thing that if a female character isn't strong and likable, it's almost anti-feminist, or certainly if she's not strong in the literal way. And I feel a lot that there's kind of tropes of these women who can kind of she can throw a punch and she looks damn good when she's doing it. And she also lives a totally ethical life, and she's a hero and she never makes mistakes, and or if she does make a mistake, she learns quickly and so and so. Whereas I enjoy that, and there's absolutely a place for that in culture. But I always find it interesting that Gillian Flynn was criticized for writing unlikable female narrators, and she was called, anti-feminist or sexist, and she was saying, why would we not show unlikable women, because they're women and they need to be represented, and we can't only present the kind of the cream of the crop and then wonder why women are so criticized. It's like, so you're kind of, the representation is these kind of really perfect creatures with no flaws, and then encountering them in real life comes up with criticism. So I'm personally drawn to an unlikable narrator, in whatever way, shape, or form. And I think there's more complexity there. It does make the reading experience or viewing experience that little bit more kind of frictious, if that makes sense. But that to me is a plus. I think it's kind of nice to, in the same way that you don't want a story without conflict, I think you don't want a character without flaws. It just makes it a little bit more interesting for me. So I kind of had fun. There were times I was with Lilia, I was like, oh, why? Like, really, with Sam, I was like, come on. Or even, Jacinta was telling her, wake up, like you're in a dream world here. And she was kind of going, la, 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 la. But I think in order to kind of make the point that I wanted to make about this kind of corrupt world, I needed a really flawed character who wasn't going to give the reader exactly what they wanted. Yeah.
I like that because we tend to think that we're so much better than these Victorian readers who wanted the women to be the better angels and to be, like you said, that arrival of civility or the place in which civilization is found. And we can't break that tradition if we don't actually do that, right? We have to be able to say, oh, writers like Gillian Flynn, or even, and it's escaping me, the European writer behind the US adaptation of His and Hers. So much was missed in those mysteries because people were fully underestimating the range of female rage and what happens to a human when you hurt them the way you've hurt them. Why would a woman not respond in that way? Why would a woman not protect herself or her children or her dream in a way? Like, we just didn't see it. I remember watching His and Hers and being completely gobsmacked by the ending because I was not used to even watching a traditional mystery like that and assigning that kind of rage to an elder Black woman. So that was, as I was reading the book, I was thinking to myself, oh, this was such a good choice because this could have been so much more boring if the protagonist had been from the get like, I'm going to show how stupid or how shallow or superficial this all is. To have someone buy in and want something and then be failed and then work through that, or even how she fails Sam and what she learns from Sam. And even that is a complicated thing when she gets the voicemail from him. It was very, very human, which does lead into my last two questions about the work itself, which is that as Lily continues to defy the odds, especially what I was expecting from her, she starts to play more dirty. She is surviving. She's getting past each round. We know that elimination in these games is a kind of symbolic form of death. But the tension is that the terror keeps ratcheting up, and it's not ratcheting up because the producers have lost control or the game has been hijacked, which is something I kind of expected. I thought, oh, this is a dystopian thriller. Like, the game itself is going to break. What is terrifying is that the game holds. And it's still scary and uncertain. And we're wondering, when will the producer step in? What's going to happen? So it was scarier to keep us in that. But how did you choose? Because you could have gone a bunch of different ways with that. Why did you choose that particular ending and outcome and that decision to play the game all the way out to the end?
Yeah, funny, when I was writing it, I never knew what was going to happen ever. The only thing that I knew was that I wanted Lily at the end. And even that, I wasn't sure how she was going to get there, and I didn't know if she was going to be with someone else until the last second, or how it was going to work. But I liked the idea, and I really liked the way you phrased it, that elimination is a kind of symbolic death. That's lovely. That each time someone goes, they're kind of faced with the consequences of that they allowed that. Essentially, they're not voted off by the public, and producers don't get rid of them, they banish each other. And that each time someone leaves, the value of the goods goes up, so they benefit each time someone goes, so they can't really pretend that it's anything other than greed. And so they kind of, Lily particularly, is left in a graveyard of the poor choices of all of the people who she lived with and kind of called her community. And I did wonder, I just wrote it scene by scene, and I always say I kind of felt like I was watching the show, and that I kind of would sit down and go, well, what's going to happen next? And I really did kind of let the characters lead. And I felt that once I saw Tom emerge as this kind of malevolent figure, that he was going to do a lot of the work for me, if that makes sense. That
Yes.
the producers weren't going to be kind of needed, and actually the producers only step in really to stop them harming each other more. And that when Andrew's very sick, they take him and heal him, and maybe more, who knows. But certainly when Becca and Tom have their violent altercation, they come, and this is the moment in the novel where Lily is the most frightened, and it's not because of Tom, it's because the producers are there, and she's kind of reminded, oh God, we're all puppets, and they're just waiting for us to do something that requires them to come in and remind us that we're all just kind of pawns in their game. But they don't really. I definitely much more wanted it to be about a community of people who are destroyed by their own greed, rather than those kind of the external forces. Like, I kind of wanted to center it on the characters and how they all kind of they all force the hand of their own downfall. I think your question had two parts. That's what I can remember.
Yeah, sorry, because I am, especially now that my producers and no one's around, I can ask these very long questions. Um, yeah, the game itself, I think, is part of what my audience was, but in some ways, you have answered that if you don't feel like going into that again, because you did have to create. You didn't just like say, "Oh, we're in Love Island." And it's the same game with the same rules. You did create your own game, and I know you said you referenced and you borrowed certain things and things have to work to get the characters to a certain place. But is there any thought on the game you constructed yourself?
And that, yeah, I mean, again, this kind of idea of a kind of the the moral price. The challenges were kind of them placing a moral or an ethical price on, comfort. What am I going to do to get this? What am I going to do that? But also the other kind of thing, which I kind of feel like I didn't talk about, was that for personal tasks, they're not allowed to reveal if they are carrying out a task. And this creates this overwhelming sense of insincerity in everything that they do. They're worried that everything is a transaction, and that any kind of, not even any kind of kind gesture, but anything that they're doing is in anticipation of a reward, and therefore no one can really trust anything that's done. And this to me, it felt a little bit in line with maybe influencer culture, and that everything is kind of everything's in anticipation of a reward or some kind of monetary gain or something. And I have to say, it really did and does kind of sicken me just how normalized it is to kind of go online and reveal aspects of your life and beg for a prize, if that makes sense. Like the kind of thing of, oh, follow me as I spend a day doing blah blah blah. It's like, I'm brushing my hair with this brush. It's not sponsored, but please sponsor me. And this idea that you getting to know someone, or I know it's obviously parasocial, is kind of contingent on the possibility of an external word. It's exhausting. It makes everything so insincere. And I don't think it is just influencer culture. I do think it is seeping into the broader culture, this idea of human interaction as transactional. And it just, for me, it just makes me want to drop off the face of the earth. I think that we're all burnt out in so many different ways from the kind of lifestyle that we're forced to live. But this transactional nature erodes relationships and it erodes trust. And yeah, so having that as a kind of rule and a kind of feeling in the show and in the compound was really fun, because even I was suspicious of everyone. I was like, why are you doing that? Like, what's
Yes.
the purpose of that?
That was such a good element because we don't often get to see that nakedly in the shows that we're watching. So, you're running around with that cynicism, or even in social settings or friend groups, or even in these discussions about no contact with certain people or cutting people off, and how there's this discourse about how, oh, I don't want to be a person who is performing a role or function in this person's life to make them feel good. I am no longer going to stay in relationship with this person so that they can appear to be a good parent, they can appear to be a good in-law, they can appear to be a good friend. I will remove myself from that situation. They don't have that opportunity on the show. They don't have that opportunity. And when you're an influencer, there's also, like you said, that kind of sickening realization of, I've already put my family as a content pillar, I've already put this aspect of my life as a content pillar in my business. You can't just reel that back in when it's uncomfortable. You can, but it will cost you. I guess the only other, well, granted, I could sit and talk to you literally all day about all the different characters, and just even Andrew and how he sees the producers in this kind of godlike way, or Jacintha's being so beautiful, but then being ranked lower, and how that you kind of exposed that even the contestants themselves are not always adequately or correctly judging any given situation or the social hierarchy, or and how Lily sees through that. I did want to touch on what you thought about humiliation and the use of humiliation in the communal and personal tasks, because that to me was one of the hardest things to read within this novel, was when there's this realization that, oh, that person's doing this because of it's a task, but that is so god awful embarrassing beyond just like prancing around being hot.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I don't know. It makes me sad in real life and in the book. And I think that, again, just getting back to that lovely phrase you used of eliminations as symbolic deaths, that I think in every show, no matter what it is, like if it's like X Factor or I can't, like a dating show or whatever, everyone has this fear of like, oh, it'd be awful to be the worst to go, like that would be really embarrassing. And kind of humiliation or embarrassment is inherent to the structure of the show, that someone has to go, someone has to be embarrassed, and often someone has to betray someone or something like this. But that humiliation is kind of the baseline, in that I think if you put a camera in front of someone for long enough, they're going to do something that either kind of actively or passively embarrasses them. And I think that's human nature, in that you kind of you get off the phone with someone, you think, oh, why did I say that? But, when you're being filmed for a day or days or weeks, it's tenfold. And that the baseline level of humiliation, even just sort of being in this constructed reality, means that it allows for much deeper and more kind of impactful humiliations. And again, I just don't see that it needs to be such an important currency on these shows. One of the lovely things about publishing this book is that I've been able to have loads of lovely conversations like the one we're having now, and hear other people's thoughts, and learn from other people's insights. And something that someone asked me like a year ago, and I've never kind of landed on an answer, and I'm interested if you have an answer. But someone asked, can reality television ever be good? And that really kind of flummoxed me. And I remember thinking of the Great British Bake Off, or the Great British Baking Show, and I kind of was thinking, surely surely it's not all bad. Like, surely it doesn't have to be bad. But I don't know. I can't figure it out if so much of these shows does not Bake Off, but if so much of these shows does depend on humiliation, can it ever be a good idea? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts?
That is such a good question. And I think if it's taken you a year, it would also take me a year as well, because if you don't have the embarrassing tasks or the editing around the the mishaps, because the editing itself can make a mishap that's just part of like a baking challenge or whatever seem much worse. So you could take an ethical consideration into how you edit and frame something, but that part of you're a studio with the ability to offer a cash prize in a inherently unequal context where the motivation for why someone would be on the show, whether the show is less humiliating or painful or not, is because of those, stark inequalities. That's when you start to, like you said, you start to wonder, is it possible? Is it possible to just give kids a fun summer of dating and a cash prize at the end? But when it involves, like you said, the audience, it involves the fact that for there to be winners, there have to be losers. And for there to be any interest for them to even have the money to give the prize, it has to be intriguing enough to watch. It's like the snake eating its tail. I don't know. Something we'd have to, oh gosh, something we'd have to think of. Does that in any way play into your disinvestment from social media, though? Did any of this happen around the same time or no?
Kind of, yes. Like, I just felt very burnt out by it. I felt that, yeah, I don't know. There's so much good and to be gained from social media. Absolutely. I just find myself that, yeah, I just, that thing of where is the day gone? What have I actually gained from but I'm absolutely not judging people for being on social media. I genuinely would never do that, and I'm sure that there might be a point where I'm on all of them, and I
You're
become
like, you
like a
have to.
teenager again. No, so look, we all have our way to get through the day, and
Right.
it's hard living,
It's
so
it
it's
is. Because
whatever
then,
we.
like you said, the ethical considerations of, can is there a way to produce reality television in an ethical way? Is there a way for me to produce my own media or consume other people's produced media in a way that's not harming them? One example is, I think, like the Resilient Jenkins family, where you have this family that's living in a motel, and they're living there because of certain romantic choices that the mother is very openly making, and they just keep adding children to the situation and sort of streaming this survival. And in a way, there's people that watch and comment, oh, you should do this, oh, stop doing that, whatever. But there's people watching out of spite, there's people watching because they really want to and they want to give the family money. All of it is rewarding this stasis of neglect and this lack of care. And what we've noticed, it's been almost a year and a half, and they're not leaving because they've figured out that living in that state is what's bringing in the money. But the money is now going back to the parents instead of the children are actually moving anyone out. So you have that thing of like, there are people that want to keep tabs on them so that maybe they can report them. But all views, bad or good, are contributing to the finances of this family. And I'm watching more and more families, which you can be thankful that you don't have to look at this. I'm watching more and more families in these kind of desperate situations realize that by performing this desperation online and by growing their families and letting people watch those pregnancies and watch those births and all that, that they can actually find great success. And it's almost the opposite of that shiny influencer world, and where you're being viewed because you're performing this kind of motherhood or relationship in this beautiful aesthetic way. This is the complete opposite, but at the same time, it's not that much of an opposite because it's full exposure or seemingly full exposure, and it's the shock, the same kind of like, whoa, that same pull and that draw. And there's no way to ethically consume, there's just no way to ethically consume that. So that's a new, people are producing their own unscripted television now on online. But I guess the last, because I also want to, I realize too, I've now taken 2 hours of your time.
Sorry.
What what is next for you in terms of, I mean, I know you're studying and you have to, that's its own writing. But what do you think is next in terms of your love of novels or literature? And is there anything you would want to give some of our listeners who are writers and who look at your this debut novel and the success it's had as an inspiration?
Oh gosh. uh,
You've earned it, so you can say.
you got me until that last one. No, in terms of what's next, I'm happily writing my next one, and that's been really nice, and I'm having loads of fun with it. And I definitely like looking at things in kind of popular culture and then kind of stepping back and wondering about maybe their significance or a relationship to them. So I think that's going to be a kind of theme for the next couple. But any advice for any aspiring writers? I wrote the compound, when I was 25, and I kind of have been asked her a good few times, or kind of there's this assumption that like, and you always want to be a writer, and I always say no, because I had this ridiculous notion in my head that is so laughable now, that writers were these kind of superior, very wise beings, who really were just on another tier. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Any Egypt can write a book.
No, that's not you, but okay.
And I do think that there's so much kind of self doubt, I think, in approaching anything creative, and this kind of feeling that what you do isn't good enough, or kind of even getting to the first steps, like maybe showing your manuscript to someone or sending it to an agent. And what's kind of holding you back is this feeling that it's not good enough. But something that I would say that I found a great comfort in the publishing process that I didn't realize is that publishing is really very collaborative, and that there are many, many people who work with you to publish a book, whether it's the illustrator or the editor or the agent or the publicist, or there's 1,000 different jobs, and everyone has the same goal, which is kind of getting that story out there. And I think that the very, very early steps can seem the scariest, the thing of sending it to someone, but know that, first of all, you can do it, and second of all, there's a community of people who want to help you and want to kind of make that story accessible for people beyond yourself. And that, yeah, just kind of getting over that little first hurdle can make it all, yeah, just get past the first kind of hedge of self-doubt, and it gets easier.
That is so helpful. And I know just from what people have DM'd me and asked me in preparation for this, because they were so excited to hear that you were coming on, that we appreciate that. And also, thank you. I know you said something earlier about the quotes, and I wanted to tell you, I was hearing you and I'm thinking, thank God someone has come on the show who not only remembers the quotes, but the names of the people, because I have quotes and I can never ever remember who said it. And I'm like, well, that's useless. So it's just me talking. So I was glad someone brought the quotes, and you also brought so much of just some of the thoughts that we've been guessing what maybe you were thinking. We were, looking back over the book and wondering, and to hear it from you yourself and to also get some background, such a treat. And so I hope that we haven't scared you off enough that you will come back on for the when your next novel is out or your next piece or whatever you decide to go into. And then hopefully, I mean, I don't know what are the ethics of this. It would be cool if somebody produced your writing as a series or a show down the line. So we will be here if that happens. So
Well, thank you
thank
so
you.
much, Alex. I appreciate everything, and I'm very glad to kind of that the people in this community who are so informed and have such fantastic opinions and insights kind of took the time to read my book. So thank you so much.
For better or worse, The Process with Alex Baytall is produced and edited by me, Alex Baytall. I will see you next week.